I only owned this property for 72 hours before a $2,500 fine appeared on my front door, taped there like a declaration of war against a guy who just wanted to grow some tomatoes and fix up an old porch. Now, you have to understand, I'd spent 20 years as a structural engineer building bridges, dealing with city planners, and navigating the kind of red tape that would make a normal person's head spin. So when I bought this 47-acre patch of dirt outside of Austin, I did my homework. I pulled every title, every land survey, and every tax record back to the 1950s just to be absolutely certain I was buying freedom, not a headache, but apparently Brenda Vance didn't care about my research. Brenda was the kind of woman who wore a designer pantsuit to a construction site and didn't end oppos. T seemed to realize that her expensive heels were sinking into the mud of the driveway she had no legal right to be standing on. She was the president of the Oak Creek Estates HOA, a sprawling development of cookie-cutter McMansions that sat just past my eastern fence line, and as I stood there on my porch holding that yellow slip of paper, she was leaning against her white Lexus at the edge of the road, watching me through oversized sunglasses. She didn't in oppos. T wave. She didn't in oppos. T offer A in quote. Welcome to the neighborhood in quote. Fruit basket. She just stared, and in that moment I realized that my dream of a quiet retirement was about to become a full-scale legal insurgency. The notice claimed I had failed to submit A in quote. Mandatory architectural review in quote. For the renovations I hadn't in oppos. T even started yet. And it hit me then that this wasn't in oppos. T a mistake, it was a test. I walked down the steps, the gravel crunching under my boots, and I held the paper up, asking her if she'd lost something, but Brenda just adjusted her glasses and told me, in a voice as cold as a January frost, that I had 30 days to comply with the association's aesthetic guidelines, or the fines would double every week. I tried to tell her as calmly as I could that my land was in oppos. T part of Oak Creek, that I was outside their jurisdiction by a good 200 feet, but she just smiled that thin, practice smile, the kind people use when they think they've already won, and said that in quote, record change, Mr. Sterling, and you'll find that Oak Creek has a very long reach, end quote. She didn't in oppos. T wait for a rebuttal. She just climbed back into her climate-controlled bubble and drove away, leaving me standing in the Texas heat with a rising sense of, end quote, oh, absolutely not, end quote. I went back inside, sat at my kitchen table, which was still covered in boxes, and I spread out my deed alongside that yellow notice, looking at the legal description of my land compared to the vague, threatening language of her HOA bylaws. I had paid $300,000 for this place, a steal because it had been tied up in tax liens for years after the previous owner. A guy named Elias Thorne went missing from the grid, and I knew for a fact that the county had held the title from 2018 until I bought it last month. There was no way, legally or logically, that an HOA could annex private property that was owned by the government without a massive public hearing, which meant Brenda was either delusional or she was running a very sophisticated scam. A few days later, things started getting weirder because I wasn't into oppos. T just getting letters anymore. I was getting, in quote, visitors, in quote. I'd be out by the old barn trying to figure out which beams were salvageable, and I'd see a dark SUV parked on the shoulder of the road, just idling there for 20 minutes before pulling away. Then, I went into town to grab some hardware, and the guy behind the counter, someone I chatted with twice before, barely looked me in the eye when he handed me my change. He muttered something about how it was a shame I was, in quote, trying to tank the property values of the whole ridge, end quote. And when I asked him what he meant, he just shook his head and walked into the back room. Brenda was poisoning the well, turning a town I hadn't into oppos. T even lived in for a month against me before I'd even finished unpacking my socks. And that was the moment my engineering brain clicked over from, in quote, observation, in quote, to, in quote, demolition, in quote. I decided to go to their next board meeting, not to argue, but to observe the enemy in her natural habitat. And let me tell you, that community center felt more like a courtroom than a neighborhood gathering. Brenda sat at the head of a mahogany table, flanked by a treasurer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and a secretary who was typing so fast I thought her keyboard might catch fire. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't in oppos. TL, I just laid my deed on the table and asked for the specific document that proved my land was under their thumb. Brenda didn't in oppos. To even blink, She just signaled to the treasurer, who slid a photocopied, amendment of annexation, across the table, dated 2020, with a signature at the bottom that supposedly belonged to Elias Thorne. I looked at that signature, then I looked at Brenda, and I felt this strange, calm wash over me because I knew right then that I had her. Elias Thorne had been dead since 2019. I'd seen the death certificate in the county archives while I was doing my due diligence, so unless Brenda was practicing necromancy, there was no way a dead man signed an annexation agreement a year after he passed away while the county owned the dirt. I didn't oppose. Tell her that, though. I just thanked her for the clarity and took a photo of the document and walked out, because in engineering, you don and oppose. Tell the contract of the bridge is going to fail while they in oppose. Still pouring the concrete. You wait until they in oppose. Redone, so they have to pay to tear it all down. That evening, I got a knock on my door, and it wasn't an oppose, a process server or a Karen. It was an old man named Silas who lived in a small cabin just down the road from me. He looked like he'd been carved out of a piece of hickory, and he told me, over a glass of iced tea, that I was the fourth person to buy the Thorne farm in 5 years. He told me about a young couple who tried to start an organic garden, only to have their irrigation lines cut and their soil salted until they went broke and sold out at a loss. He told me about a contractor who wanted to build a workshop but fled after his equipment was vandalized, and he started getting anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. And the kicker? All of them sold their land to a shell company called, Vance Land Holdings, for pennies on the dollar. It all made sense then. The HOA wasn't oppose. Just a power trip for Brenda. It was a harvesting machine. She'd used the HOA and oppose, legal fund, which wasn't oppose, her money, to harass independent owners until they broke, buy the land through her side company. And then, Silas suspected, she was planning to flip the entire 47-acre block to a major developer who wanted to build a luxury golf course. I was just the latest obstacle in her retirement plan, but what Brenda didn't oppose, realized, was that I wasn't oppose. A young couple with a dream or a contractor with a mortgage. I was a man with a lot of time, a decent pension, and a very specific set of skills involving blueprints and public records. I spent the next 2 weeks in what I called, the war room, which was just my second bedroom with maps and documents pinned to every square inch of the walls. I hired a private surveyor, a guy named Miller who didn't oppose. Take any crap, and I had him stake out the absolute, ironclad boundaries of my property. We found the original 1960s iron pins buried under a foot of silt, proving that not only was I not in the HOA, but the HOA had actually paved about 10 feet of their, community nature trail, onto my land. Brenda hadn't oppose. Just overreached legally. She had physically trespassed, and in Texas, that's a very expensive mistake to make. Then came the, the big reveal, I waited for the quarterly, town hall, where the developer was supposed to present the preliminary plans for the golf course expansion, a meeting that Brenda had hyped up as a, win-win for property values, The room was packed with residents who thought they were getting a country club, and Brenda was up there on the stage, basking in the glow of the projector screen. I waited until the cue and damp, the session, and I didn't oppose. Go to the microphone. I just walked up to the stage with a stack of folders. I started by showing the death certificate of Elias Thorne on the big screen. I brought my own laptop and just plugged it into the HDMI cord while the secretary was distracted. I showed the signature on Brenda's, annexation, document next to the date of Elias's burial, and you could hear the air go out of the room. I explained very clearly and very loudly how Brenda had used HOA funds to hire a law firm to harass me based on a forged document. But I didn't oppose. Stopped there. I showed the, Vance Land Holdings, incorporation papers and the list of previous owners who had sold to her after being fined in a bankruptcy. The residents wearing and oppose. Just shocked. They were realizing that their monthly dues had been used to fund Brenda's private real estate empire. The best part, though, the real, chef's kiss, moment, was when I showed the survey map. I told the room that because the HOA had built a permanent structure, the nature trail, on my private property without an easement, I was legally entitled to either have it demolished or charge the HOA, usage fee, of $5,000 a month, backdated to the day of construction. The treasurer actually put his head in his hands, and Brenda looked like she was trying to swallow a lemon. She tried to claim I was a liar, that I was, disturbing the peace, but the residents weren't and oppose listening to her anymore. They were looking at the forged signature on the screen and looking at their own checkbooks. The aftermath was a beautiful, chaotic mess. The board voted to remove Brenda that night. An emergency audit was triggered, and the Vance Land Holdings, scheme fell apart under the weight of 3 different lawsuits from the previous owners who realized they'd been defrauded. I didn't oppose. Ended up charging them for the trail. I just made them sign a permanent boundary agreement that gave me a 10-foot buffer of, no man in oppose, where they had to plant a row of thick cedar trees to hide their McMansions from my view. Now, I sit on my porch every evening, watching those cedars grow, and the silence is exactly what I paid for. Every now and then, I see a white Lexus drive slowly past the gate. Brenda doesn't oppose. Live in the neighborhood anymore. She had to sell her house to pay her legal fees, and I just raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. She thought she was playing a game of chess against a pawn, but she forgot that in the world of engineering, if you don and oppose, respect the foundation, the whole house comes down on your head. But it makes me wonder how many other, Brendas, are out there right now, using a little bit of borrowed power to strip people of their homes. How many of you have looked at a yellow notice on your door and felt that pit in your stomach, wondering if you should just give up and move on? I stayed and fought because I had the resources, but most people don and oppose, and that's the real crime here. Was I right to tear her world down in front of everyone, or should I have just taken her to court quietly and moved on with my life? Personally, I think some people need to see the bridge collapse before they stop trying to cross it. What do you think? Drop a comment below and let me know if you would have handled Brenda differently, or if you've got an HOA horror story of your own. I'll be reading them from the porch.